And before we start, I want to thank all of our speakers today, and we have little gifts from the Environmental Law and Policy Forum and Duke Law for you up here, so please don't leave without one for everyone who spoke today. And now I want to turn it over to Michelle Nolan, I do know her name, who's going to moderate our fourth panel and who is on faculty here and helps run the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, which I currently am taking and enjoy very much. So thank you, Michelle.
So thanks everyone for being here, and I want to give a special thanks to the students affiliated with the Environmental Law and Policy Forum for regrouping after the snowstorm and ice storm canceled the first scheduling of this conference. And thank you also to all the speakers who were able to accommodate and change your schedules to be able to be here for the second time. This is a particularly gratifying and important conference for me. When I was a student here a long time ago, in 1990, we organized a conference on civil rights and the environment to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the first Earth Day. And so this is very much a kind of full circle for me to see this issue still has a lot of resonance, and that the principles that we explored in that first conference are still being discussed today, put into practice, and hopefully saving a lot of pressure and stress in communities that are traditionally affected by the environmental burdens of our society. So I want to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We're going to be leading off with Annette Hyatt. Annette is a senior staff attorney with the Land Loss Prevention Project, which is a very important organization based here in Durham, North Carolina, focusing on efforts to help retain ownership among African American and other minority communities across the Southeast. She graduated from UNC Charlotte with a degree in social work and got her law degree from Case Western University School of Law. She started working with Land Loss Prevention Project originally in 2001 to 2008. And then rejoined the staff in 2012. During that interim period, she worked with a nonprofit focused on assisting farmers in Southeast Asia and also with Central California Legal Services. She was also, during that time, a visiting scholar at Columbia University's Center for Human Rights. So we're very happy to have her here today. Danielle Purifoy is our other speaker. She's an attorney and a PhD candidate right now in the School of the Environment, focusing her dissertation research on environmental justice. She's focused particularly on the intersection of social justice and the environment and food justice. She received her bachelor's degree from Vassar College in 2006 and her JD from Harvard Law School. And prior to graduate school, she served with City Year in Louisiana and also worked for 2 years at the Office of Recovery and Development Administration in the city of New Orleans, helping with environmental planning in the wake of hurricanes Katrina and Rita. We had a third speaker lined up today, Dr. Beverly Wright with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. She works on a lot of the concerns around Chemical Alley in Louisiana, the legacy of the petroleum and oil development industry down there. So unfortunately, she had a family emergency and wasn't able to attend today, but I hope that you will look for the paper that will be published in the symposium edition of the Environmental Law and Policy Forum. She wrote a really excellent paper looking at some of the different communities in Chemical Alley and how they have responded to the extraordinary issues of environmental injustice in that area. So thank you very much for being here, and look forward to the talks.
Hello, how are you guys? As Dr. Nolan mentioned, my name is Annette Hyde. I work with the Land Loss Prevention Project. We're a nonprofit law firm based in Durham, and what we do is we give free legal assistance to low-income landowners and community groups that are working to retain ownership of land resources. when I was thinking about coming out to speak to you guys, I was thinking that as attorneys or law students, we always look at the legal options and what is it that we're looking at. But we don't always see on the ground what it is that communities deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I thought I would just put together a little bit of a pictorial demonstration of what environmental justice looks like to the people. And it's not even close to what it looks like to the people on the ground itself. So I'm going to see if I can work this. Y'all bear with me. You already have heard firsthand, or you can, from Dr. Lee and Ms. Burwell about the Warren County landfill when it was sited. In Warren County, it was almost 75% or higher African American community. And they had protests beginning in the early 80s where more than 500 people were arrested. And basically, Governor Hunt promised that it was going to be the state-of-the-art landfill. They had to clean up over 60,000 tons of PCB-contaminated soil, and it was dumped over in 1978. It was 31,000 gallons of oil that was dumped along the roadsides. When they capped the landfill, they realized that there was 1 million gallons of water underneath the landfill, and then they had to clean up the soil. So they actually incinerated the soil, and that cleanup was finished in 2004 at a cost of $17 million. So landfills are everywhere across the state. There's 40 municipal solid waste landfills, and this is not easy to see, but the pink spikes, the tallest ones, show the landfills that have more than 80 years of capacity left in them. And then the blue are capacity in tons. So the tallest spike is 40 million tons. So what goes into municipal solid waste landfill? Something called putrescible waste. So garbage, non-hazardous sludge, industrial solid waste, construction debris. What is banned is paint, chemicals, motor oils, batteries, pesticides, because they're considered to be household hazardous waste. But when people are dealing with living next to a landfill, this is what they see. There was a landfill that was sited, it was supposed to be sited in Wake County that was going to be 300 feet tall. And then eventually you have to close the landfill, and what do you do with it? You make it a park. You can make it a park. This is the North Wake Landfill County Park. There's some good trails, I guess, and a nice playground to go play with your children. For example, there's a county landfill in Orange County. It closed in June of 2013. It's still a place that you can go take your mobile home and drop it off. It's a construction and demolition landfill at this point. So that means you can take mattresses, stumps, construction debris, and mobile homes. So the other part of one of the issues that North Carolina deals a lot with is confined animal feeding operations. We have the unenviable position of being one of the top producers of hogs and pigs in the country. In March of this year, there were 8 million hogs and pigs in North Carolina. Our state's population is only 9.8 million. So this shows you how many there really are. And with any kind of confined animal operation, you have to get rid of the waste. So with these big, big industrial farms, what they do is they have lagoons that go back behind the farms into big ponds. So that's a concern that a lot of people have. When the hurricanes come, particularly in the eastern part of the state, they had overflows of these waste lagoons. That's one of the issues that is very common here. You probably already talked about it, the upcoming issues potentially with fracking. The Triassic Rift is most prevalent in more Lee, Chatham counties. Lee is a special county because it's 41% communities of color, where the state average is lower than that. It's 10.6% unemployment, and 16.8% of the county lives under the poverty line. So the other thing is obviously the toxics and pesticide use. So I just really wanted to give you an overview, kind of pictures of what people see. I can't let you smell it, you can't feel it, we don't know what it's like to live next to a landfill or to live next to one of these waste lagoons. I've had clients tell me they can't open their doors, they can't open their windows, they can't dry their clothes outside because of the odor. But it is industry, and North Carolina's industry is heavily agricultural. We have 52,000 farms in the state, and that's down 8,000 in 10 years. It covers over 8.5 million acres of land. 82% of our farmers, though, make under $50,000 a year from agriculture, which means most of our farmers are small farmers. They're either producing for personal consumption or just small consumption. And that is one of the things that makes it so important for what Danielle's going to kind of tie into in terms of what we do and how we supply for our communities that are food insecure, which is also another concern. So I'm going to kind of shift from there, and then we'll have more time for questions.
So Annette's presentation, we actually didn't plan this, dovetails really nicely into what I'm going to talk about today, which is three things: food policy councils, environmental justice, and food justice. And what I'm going to essentially do is make two arguments. First, I'm going to make an argument connecting environmental justice and food justice, both of those movements, and talk about how they intersect and why we should integrate them more in our advocacy. And then two, I'm going to connect both environmental justice and food justice to an emerging trend, a rapidly accelerating trend across the country, which is the proliferation of food policy councils. Okay, so first I'm going to define what food policy councils are for those who aren't familiar with them. Essentially, they are democratic forms for discourse and advocacy around food system issues at the local, regional, and state levels. They provide us with some sustained collective action at these levels, at these more localized levels, to advocate for things like food insecurity, things like sustainable agriculture, and other localized food issues. And this is important because, as Annette was saying, and as I'm sure many of you know, we sort of exist right now in a very globalized, industrialized food system that really isn't interested a lot in local production and doesn't really take into account a lot of the local costs of its production, essentially. So we get cheaper food, essentially, on the back end in some ways, but it's generally less healthy for us and worse for the environment. And I should say that these, as I said back in this slide, essentially, these are sort of centralized bodies. Back in 1981, there was, in Knoxville, Tennessee, had the first food policy council, and it was conceived as kind of a localized department of food, if you will, because there really isn't, you have food safety in local government, and then you have sort of nationalized departments and regulatory agencies around agriculture, but you don't have really any agencies that are directly addressing local food issues as such. And so that's how it was originally conceived. And it was also conceived as providing some kind of community accountability it was conceived as providing some sort of accountability to communities around these food issues. Okay, so for like 50th time, let's discuss what environmental justice is. As I mentioned earlier, the EPA's definition has a lot to do with addressing sort of distributive justice issues and procedural justice issues, which are only two of the four categories of justice issues that Kuhn identifies around environmental justice. So the last two are, of course, corrective justice, looking retrospectively as well as prospectively and mitigating environmental harms, and social justice, which is about mitigating inequalities, underlying inequalities that have environmental outcomes. So that's sort of my take on what environmental justice is. I agree with Kuhn's construction of it. And it's important to also understand the history of the environmental justice movement as a departure from traditional environmentalism, that the traditional environmentalism that arose in the wake of Silent Spring in 1962 and the rise of a lot of the so-called Big Ten environmental organizations. The idea in environmental justice is actually that movement, that traditional movement, wasn't interested or invested in the specific environmental issues that were faced by communities of color and low-income communities. So this is where the environmental justice movement comes from. And food justice is arguably just a sort of direct parallel to the environmental justice movement in terms of its scope and its cause. This movement is considerably newer in scope in terms of being called a food justice movement. Some people refer to it as a community food security movement. I think that community food security is probably embedded within food justice. And essentially, it's a departure from this sort of mainstream sustainable food movement that you see. If you think about the work of Michael Pollan or Alice Waters, the sustainable food movement that some people view as more elitist and inaccessible to low-income communities and communities of color. So essentially, the idea around food justice is to have ownership not only over what you can consume, which should be good and culturally appropriate and affordable food, but also to have ownership over the means of production, to have a stake in the local food economy as well as the outcomes of that economy. So there are, I argue, three intersections for environmental justice and food justice. The first is, and I'm sorry if you can't read that, public health and safety. So the way that I think of this intersection around public health and safety that's common to both environmental justice and food justice is if you think about the sort of grander food cycle that we're in right now. So at the outset, Land Loss Prevention Project sort of addresses who owns the land that produces the food. There was recently a large settlement on behalf of Black farmers in North Carolina for historic losses of agricultural land and ancestral land that was used for agriculture because of historic discrimination and agricultural policies. And so the means of production in a lot of cases are owned by, not necessarily wealthier either, right? Because you just said that they most of the farmers here make less than $50,000, but they're largely is a lot of these are white farmers, and certainly the sort of large-scale monoculture industrial farmers are largely white and wealthy. And so that part is, it has an impact on health because it has an impact on your economic outcomes, which has an impact in this country, at least, on your health outcomes. And then there's labor, which is the sort of gets to a lot of the farm workers issues that Annette has also worked on, exposure to pesticides in the field, and then also combined with this sort of cycle of poverty where you actually don't end up having access to the kind of food that you're producing for other people. And then on the consumption end, we go back, the inputs to the land, these pesticides, a lot of the discussion in sustainable agriculture is around, what's in the food that I'm eating, which is important, but there's very little focus on where are these pesticides plants located? These sort of petrochemical facilities that produce these pesticides are disproportionately located in low-income communities and communities of color as well. So, just at this, before you even get to the consumption stage, this production stage that produces these negative externalities that center around these public health issues. When you get to consumption, people talk about the Farm Bill and the subsidies that it creates for corn and soybean inputs that create these cheaper foods that are highly processed. There's an argument, and I'm sure, how many of you have heard of food deserts? Yeah. It's about everyone in the room. So, food deserts are not only places that have lack of access to fresh and healthy food. A lot of times they have a sort of overconcentration of highly processed and unhealthy food, which there have been arguments made as a direct result of these sort of artificial subsidies that are put on this the commodities market, essentially. So that has impacts on public health. In predominantly low-income communities and communities of color. And then there's the waste at the end, right? And Annette's just gotten to that about the municipal waste landfills being disproportionately cited in communities of color and low-income communities, which also have impacts on health. The next intersection is on ecological health. And essentially, both of these, like the mainstream environmental justice movement and the sustainable agriculture movement, food justice and environmental justice are just as concerned with ecological health, because ecological health has direct bearing on their health and safety. And there's just common concerns about preservation and conservation in those movements as well. So if you go back, if you ever look at the 17 principles of environmental justice that were founded at the 1991 People of Color Environmental Summit, ecological issues are central to those founding principles of environmental justice. And the same goes for more founding principles of food justice. And the way that those things play out is, again, in agriculture, pesticide inputs that, under the people who know Clean Water Act and all of the sort of mainstream environmental statutes, that agriculture is a huge input into is a huge contributor to environmental contamination. And then at the end, so the last intersection is around justice issues, specifically social justice issues. Arguably, both of these movements are really concerned with the underlying inequalities that are these sort of unequal outcomes in the food system and unequal outcomes in the environment are predicated on. So I think those are sort of three key reasons why they intersect and why having an integrated movement would be helpful. So my argument here is that food policy councils actually are ideal institutions that exist at the intersection of food justice and environmental justice. And part of it is because over the past 10 years, as you can see, they've spread across the country at the local, predominantly at the local and regional level, and some at the state level as well as tribes have, indigenous tribes here have adopted them. And, original arguments linking food justice and environmental justice have talked about merging these issues at the national level, which I'm not arguing against, specifically around the Farm Bill, because the issues in the Farm Bill, the sort of the food consumption subsidies and the sort of food production subsidies center around environmental justice and food justice issues as well. But I think that food is, even though we live in a globalized, industrialized food system, that the way that people access food is fundamentally local. And so as such, to get people rallied around these issues, it's arguable that food policy councils, which exist at these more localized levels, are the appropriate institutions to think about these issues. So there's some important considerations in food policy councils that can best integrate these issues. You think about food policy council demographics. If you look at a lot of the literature around food policy councils, for instance, there is actually a Durham Food Prosperity Council here. It was founded a couple of years ago, and I did an interview with a woman who's heading it up, and she talked about how the demographics were overwhelmingly white, and the focus, was on urban agriculture, which can work, in the food justice realm, but it was overwhelmingly driven by the interests of local, largely wealthy, white community members who wanted to take land in East Durham, for instance, and stuff. And so, which in theory there's nothing wrong with, but there was no engagement with the communities there around how they might access or how they might participate in this process. So arguably the Food Policy Council membership demographics and the level of participation is critical, as you talk about in both the environmental justice and food justice movements. Missions centered around inclusion and justice, and then programs that are proposed and evaluated for equitable outcomes. And so just finally, I'm going to give you a prime example of, I think, an ideal example that exists today of a great merging of environmental justice and food justice issues at the Food Policy Council level. So this is the Chicago Food Policy Advisory Council that was founded probably about 5 to 6 years ago. And the co-chair is a woman named Erica Allen, who's with Growing Power Chicago. I don't know, are any of you familiar with Growing Power? Okay, so this is an organization that started in Milwaukee. You should Google Will Allen if you are interested in this. There's a huge New York Times profile on him. His approach to food justice and environmental justice, if you read this profile, is that he was living in a low-income, majority-minority community with a lot of youth who didn't have jobs and also didn't have access to grocery stores. And he had farming expertise. And so what he did was that he started a local food co-op that the community had a direct stake in, and that the youth actually worked in and made an income. And so it had this, very integrated effect of providing economic incentives for people to participate in this sort of sustainable food issue. It's providing them, it's reducing food insecurity, and it's good for the environment. And those are the types of things in these kinds, in low-income communities and communities of color that are really essential and in a really great way to bridge environmental justice and food justice. And so Erica Allen, who is Will Allen's daughter, started Growing Power in Chicago and is now co-chairing. She's now at the helm of the Food Policy Advisory Council and is implementing those issues. And you can see it reflected in the mission, right? Facilitating responsible food policy, culturally appropriate, nutritionally sound, and affordable food. These are mission statements that you don't actually see in most of the mission statements for other food policy councils. Focuses on food security and then sustainable agriculture. And then this Food Policy Council has a direct connection to Growing Power's Growing Food and Justice Initiative, which has its as its sole focus. They have a conference every year at reducing race inequalities in the food system. And so this is probably the most ideal approach I've seen thus far to integrating these ideas of environmental justice and food justice. So I think the implications of this integration are myriad. There's increased capacity by involving people and involved in environmental justice and food justice. And some of this is already happening. It's not like this is, a new idea. But, facilitating greater integration to this movement obviously builds capacity in ways and arguably builds a sort of joined up thinking about more comprehensive, sort of multifaceted solutions to problems that could probably be more efficient than if either movement worked on its own. And then thinking about this, if we go back to that map, if food policy councils took this on as a systematic thing, integrating food justice and environmental justice, then you would start to see local food systems that were more equitable and just. And then the hope would be that in the aggregate, you would start to, as we say as lawyers, that the states are kind of the laboratories for good law in some cases. But essentially, utilizing that concept to, in the aggregate, build our way towards a better national and hopefully global food system, because you're generating the demand for a better food democracy, because people are involved and they've got something at stake now because they know they've made the connection essentially between, what the outcomes are on the ground and what needs to happen at the top. And I think that that's probably the only way to get that kind of mobilization is from the bottom up. And then, you've engendered essentially a food democracy around, where people have a much greater say in what they eat, how they eat it, and a much greater stake in the larger food economy. That is it. Thank you.
That you really want to be steering people away from?
Well, I think this is why you have to simultaneously work at the national level and the local level, but I think that the local level eventually will get to better outcomes. And, I don't think that there's any, not that I've seen at this point, tangible proof, right, that these subsidies fundamentally lead to unhealthy eating habits, right? But there's a lot of suggestion, because if you create a scenario where the cheapest foods are those kinds of processed foods, and then you oversaturate them in specific communities, and they're the only things that are really affordable, then you have these outcomes. But I think that, again, I think this is hard to do, because I think Will Allen's model is not easily replicated, because you had to have someone who already had that expertise and who already had the sort of social capital in his community to build what he's built. But to me, that is his model is ideal, because, you're feeding the local economy, which is really critical to being able to afford the food that you need. You're creating the sort of stake in the sustainable food portion of the food justice movement, which is critical, and you're involving youth, which is really important, right? And then you're reducing the access issues. He founded this around housing projects. So people could walk to this farm and get organically produced food, and were, working at this store and had a stake in it. So, I mean, maybe one option would be, doing some kind of farmer training for people who are interested in this kind of work, community partnerships and such to kind of build the kind of social capital around these issues. But to me, he's really kind of hit the nail on the head at various levels with what's supposed to happen. But otherwise, it's sort of, you have to kind of figure out how to break that cycle in some way. And I don't know how, I don't have an answer for how you do that without really getting down to, Omega was talking earlier about, really getting down to the local level, to what is happening in the local context and working within that context to really reach people.
Can I add to
Of
that?
course.
Okay. I actually have been to, the General Assembly is actually doing a study now on food deserts, which is really fabulous that they're paying attention to it. There's been a lot of groups that are coming together. So to me, I think you have a couple of problems, and I'm kind of dovetailing on what you already said. You have not only you have the farmers that are only producing for their economic viability, which means you have to produce corn, soybeans, sweet potatoes are one of the top productions in North Carolina, but they're producing 2 or 3 crops only, which means they're not producing for personal consumption, but they're also not producing for local consumption because it's being sent out to warehousers, wholesalers. So I think we need to encourage the diversification, but there's also a movement that they're providing funding and attention to the corner stores or the country store so that they can carry locally produced fruits and vegetables so that people can go there and get what they need all at one place. And it's the changing of the attention so that you can encourage that and make it economically viable for both the farmer and the corner store owner, and I'm just going to call it a corner store. And then the funding is important so you can help them buy a glass front cooler so they can keep that stuff fresh for people to come in. But they don't now sometimes see the benefits of having that. Someone testified in front of the House committee, I think it's in the western part of the state, maybe not Cleveland County, but they were saying that they actually sold more from their vegetables than they did with cigarettes. So when they are able to do that, it is making a difference. It's just getting more people to having the ability to do that, I think.
Are questions from the audience?
How much does education go into the food policy councils? Because I've seen recently that even introducing a fruit and vegetable stand in a food desert and food desert stores or stores located doesn't increase consumption always. And so just by putting it there doesn't mean that it's really reaching the population.
Yeah. I hear stories often on about this, and I think that this is sort of a dueling argument, because I've heard arguments on both sides. I think I'm actually working right now on a project in Dallas. It's actually the southern sector of Dallas, it's a neighborhood called Highland Hills that is both an environmental justice community and a food desert. It hasn't had a proper grocery store in about 40 years. And it's right across from one of the big, actually one of the largest landfills in the United States is within its borders. And they had an attempt at a grocery store that failed a couple of years ago, and it was an interesting question of why it failed. And one of the challenges I think is that when we were doing these focus groups, we found that people were going to the Walmart to do sort of one-stop shopping in some ways. And so the nearest Walmart was about a 15-minute drive away, and a lot of these folks didn't have cars. So, so it is an interesting conundrum. Part of it is, what you get used to when you don't, perhaps, I'm totally, making a guess here. What you get used to when you don't have those other things. So education may be part of it. It may also be that you have to involve people in the process of building their, local food economy. It may just be that, they get into their routines and they see that, it may be easier to kind of like go here if I just want food, but maybe the Walmart is an easier option. I don't know, I think education is important in pretty much every context, but I think that, we also have to think about other reasons why people may not be engaging, and I don't think it's all centered around education.
There's a question up in the back before the...
About fishermen. So I used to work with the Virginia Watermen's Association a little bit, and there were some issues. I mean, they were largely white, but they were also often largely poor and not terribly well educated, limited other job options, and they were having a lot of trouble, making a living doing what they were doing. And then, of course, this was in the Chesapeake Bay, so it was associated with all of these other environmental issues. And I just was wondering if there was a way to, as you've been talking about with the farming, to have a solution that might help them and people who could use the protein.
Yeah.
There are, here in North Carolina, there are a couple of different community-supported fisheries that are starting to try to do that. Walking Fish was started over at the Nicholas School by some students at the Nicholas School of the Environment, and they are working with fishermen in eastern North Carolina who are very similar to the fishermen that you described up in Virginia, and they're working with them in a cooperative fashion to teach them about sustainable harvesting methods, ways to reduce their costs, and then also providing them with direct access to a market where they can get more than, $1.99 a pound or, 99 cents a pound that they would get from the fish houses out on the coast. And so bringing it direct to the consumers here. That's reaching only a particular demographic, though, of people who are educated about that and willing to pay, a higher market share for that sustainable production. And so that is something that could be done to really connect people more with low protein areas.
It's North Carolina Fresh Catch, too.
Mm-hmm. There's Dr. Door Seafood. There are a number of different models like that that are starting to come up, and hopefully, the trend will also be the same that it's been with a lot of the community-supported agriculture. That.
Yeah, I can't think of, other than, and I'm not even sure, given everything that I've been learning about the state of fisheries right now, if this is a desirable thing about, training new fishermen. I'm not sure, and it's probably not the not the answer there. And it's probably it's a market problem because you don't really want to have people paying less for fish, right? In some ways, right? So it's very complicated when you have a source that's sort of finite and maybe conceived as being depleted, unless of course it is one of those fish species that's in abundance. That the fisheries issue, I think, is just a really complicated thing because you don't, the affordability is certainly an issue, but you kind of need it to be a higher cost because of the other ecological considerations. I think, I hadn't really even thought about that connection before, and I think that's a really hard question.
There's also the aspect of growing power that looks at aquaponics in the urban environment. So fish farming, but on a very small scale. So you're integrating, taking the maybe some of the composted material that you gather from food waste as a growing medium in urban environments, and then growing those plants in an aquatic setting that also has certain fish. Maybe I think tilapia are very easy to grow in that environment. So they feed off of some of the vegetation detritus, and then you have a sustainable, very efficiently produced and affordable source of protein also within that urban environment. that may be one model that could be employed.
I think this hits really well on the importance of outreach, both within the community itself in terms of culturally appropriate foods, like you mentioned. What if what's going in the corner store is not what anybody eats? You know, but also outreach to the farmers, because the average age of farmers, and I don't know about fishermen, but the average age of farmers used to be 57, and you have issues with passing the farm along, that generations, sometimes long livelihood that people have invested in. It's who they are. But if they're not able to make it, why are you going to encourage your grandson or granddaughter to take up farming if you can't even make it? You know, poultry farmers in North Carolina, you couldn't pay me to be a poultry farmer, because they take out $500,000 in loans, and you know, a lot of them are losing their farms. And you know, so how do you encourage people to continue that on if it's not economically viable? You know, whether that's vegetable production, diversified production, farming, or fishing. You know, it's in reaching out to them to what really works for them and keeping them in it, because there's a big focus on new and beginning farmers, and that's important. But we also have to reach out to maybe re-entering farmers, veterans that need positions, but also keeping our existing farmers there, because we're going to need them.
A question in a different direction. I actually have some more questions about this too. But in terms of your work with land loss prevention, do you deal with, say, the economic viability of these farming communities? So the loss of value of the homes and land of people who live next to these confined animal feedlot operations, for example. I mean, I think by analogy of what happened in Pennsylvania, where you had the Centralia fires burning underground for decades, and all of the folks living above those had houses and land worth nothing. They couldn't sell them. They couldn't do anything with them. And we're doing that again in our communities with CAFOs. And I suspect when fracking comes in after the initial profits are reaped, we'll have the same situation. So in terms of economic vitality and community vitality combined with the economics of farming, is this what you deal with? And are there policies in place?
I mean, I think that there's the proactive and the reactive. You know, the proactive being the outreach to people to tell them that they don't need to lease mineral rights for $1 or $2 an acre. To tell them that there are rights. I mean, as the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network and SDLC did a study looking at the people that are starting to sign leases for fracking, and it's more highly represented by farmer or landowners of color. You know, it's already becoming a reactive reality, where you're going to have to do issues like later with contamination or lawsuits to help you do that. I mean, I think you have something possible. I didn't really talk about community benefits analysis, but that's one thing that people have used when they've done big sightings of municipalities come in. You know, with Staples Center is someone that a lot of people think of, is negotiating an agreement with a big party that's coming into the land. How that links up to everything here, it's really difficult, because I don't think there's anything formal in place. It's either doing the education ahead of time or afterward with some of the unfortunate lawsuits that might come out of it. That's kind of how I see it. I mean, are we involved in it? Yes. But we're primarily in education.
So the recourse at this point are lawsuits. So you sue the CAFO owner for the loss of value of your home and property.
Trespass is one suit. The lawsuits in North Carolina are difficult because you have the administrative process first that you have to go through.
And there's a forced mediation provision as well for any challenge to a bona fide farming operation.
So it's an uphill battle no matter what. Even in citing, it's kind of a problem. Now you have to correct me, there was a moratorium on the location of CAFOs. Is that still in place?
It's been lifted, but it's no longer authorized to build facilities with lagoons and spray fields, so you have to use modern waste treatment technologies if you're going to build a new facility or expand an existing facility.
That kind of leaves us with the retroactive, reactive.
Thanks.
Question in the back, Megan?
My question was connected to what Dr. Geller was saying, but it's specifically related to the fracking. In April 2012, our organization, the Western Revitalization Association, in partnership with the Haw River Assembly Riverkeepers, filed a interagency fracking complaint about the inclusion of public health laws, Title VI civil rights, the whole list of things. And agriculture was one of those federal agencies, state agencies, agencies, of course, that receives federal monies, about how it addresses the holistic point of what fracking can do adversely to the community. And one of the things that we raised is, of course, one of North Carolina's biggest dollar income is, of course, agriculture. And one of the other bigger income pieces that's that North Carolina's continuing to grow is tourism. And a lot of the tourism, or a larger part of it, is going around the agricultural or the natural part of our environment. So when you start talking about food and losing of land, I'm not sure how to phrase the question, but in your research and your work, are you able to yet address the whole question of what that kind of industry shock might do to the food chain and the human impact, to the extent where everybody may be eating the right kind of food and everything and growing fresh vegetables, but if you have oil drilling right next to your water and the air, it's contaminating the animals that you're raising on pasture raised or your field raised chickens and turkeys and stuff, and your human beings are on the best diet possible. I mean, that it possibly can nullify. I'm gonna go back to Amy. I'm not picking on Amy. What she said, our governor said the cost benefit analysis. I mean, the cost of the fracking process designed to create quote unquote human wealth and convenience is so high that it actually nullifies, what it does to food, the food process, the human beings involved. I mean, I'm making a big, complicated diagram, I guess, but I mean, is this something that anybody has even drawn a little sketch to see we need to develop this cost benefit of analysis as to how it relates to the whole?
So I think that, part of the problem with this fracking thing, which is so bizarre in the States, since we don't really have, it's not that we have that much gas or oil, is that, there really isn't any sort of prospective look at what the value of the land will be, or what the impacts will be, what the long-term economic costs will be. We have a sort of a short-term, I think we have a short-term, long-term problem. So I think that's part of the calculation in a lot of these really invasive mining type industries is this is super academic, discounting the future, essentially. You're really not considering those long-term impacts. Let somebody else deal with them. But to your point about the integration with food, there is some interesting research being done at the School of Public Health at UNC, and to a certain extent at UC Berkeley, I think, about and this is also, I should have mentioned, that gets to this integration of environmental justice and food justice, is that, what happens, and this is kind of different than what you're saying, but when you have nutritional deficits in addition to these environmental hazards, that exacerbates your health issue, your health problem, right? So the healthier foods can arguably even mitigate some of the health hazards you may be experiencing, even if disproportionately. So, but it doesn't, but it, it does, raise a legitimate question. It can only do so much. The food and the nutrition can only do so much if you're, being poisoned in all these other ways. And then, you talk about us having the best diet possible while they're fracking. Well, if they're contaminating our water supply, then I don't see how we can have a viable agricultural industry. So I think that these things all go hand in hand. And the point is to, try to figure out a way to mobilize people on these two things. I think it's very difficult, but I think that it's sort of I don't think it's too idealistic, but I think it's sort of an important conversation that has been happening. I just think it needs to happen more. And now that we've got these councils in place that, people are starting to take notice to all of these things and to mobilize around them, we just need to figure out a way to incorporate all of these things we've been working on for however long into that process. So I think you're dead on, but I haven't seen any studies directly that talk about specifically what you're saying at this point.
Another question? Michael?
Yeah, so I was going to ask, since so much of the landscape of food, it sounds like you were saying, is a lot of it is the product of the kind of government's role in kind of like subsidizing certain industries over the others and which encourages like monoculture of certain crops, and I feel like a lot of the way that they're able to accomplish that is it's much easier for them to coordinate than these small farmers. And so I was wondering if the degree to which these food councils are politicized, if at all, and have they ever tried to kind of like form a counterbalance to those, larger, more coordinated interests?
Yeah, I think that, for instance, in Illinois, as I think an outcome of the Chicago Food Policy Council, they actually passed an act around, where Illinois sources its food, for the state food system. And I can't remember the specific provisions, but it actually created effectively a state food policy council that had to have certain amount of members from each sort of government agency and so on and so forth, and would coordinate with some of the local policy councils across the state. So one way, part of the way I think these food policy councils essentially, I think some of them do politicize at the national level. I mean, we've just had, finally the sort of passage of this latest iteration of the Farm Bill, which is in no way ideal, but you can certainly see, local organizations, or at least food policy councils, facilitating organizations that do mobilize at the national level. But part of this Illinois thing is just sort of creating the demand. We are not taking food from X, Y, and Z. Now we are really investing in our local agriculture, which means we need to systematically change the way that we do it. And I think that's part of what I see as kind of hopefully the race to the top around the food system issues is, the increased demand for good food, for real food, essentially.
North Carolina actually had a state food policy council. It was formed by the General Assembly. I think that it was a political creature, and it had representatives from state agencies and nonprofits, and it was actually kind of undone by the legislature, but those members are still continuing to meet informally as they restructure and see how they want to go forward. But the movement has already been mentioned with the local food policies it's a very interesting process in North Carolina because it's very ground up. They're working together on the ground. It's not a top-down policy, you're going to have a food policy council here. It's people getting together and figuring out what they really want to work, and those are gaining traction. And then they'll meet over here and they do regional feeding up to the state. So there was kind of a political creature in terms of their ability to force change. Not so much yet, I don't think. But I think that's the importance of a ground movement, a grassroots movement, is that the change will have to happen because the people that are most affected by it are already doing it. Then the policy will catch up with it, hopefully. But right now, I think there's 11 or 17 food policy councils in North Carolina.
This map kind of points that, I think the map is current as of 2012, so it may have been just before the election. So but there's one that's forming in Alamance County right now. The Durham Food Prosperity Council is kind of dissolved in a way, but now is kind of reformulating. So if you guys are interested in this stuff in Durham, I would follow, there's this group called Denage that's in, they're quasi-governmental. I don't really understand their affiliation. I don't know. But like I got an email about it because they're working with UNC to build a new Durham Food Policy Council. So, if you're interested in this stuff, I'm trying to become involved in like some kind of way because I'm really interested in how this is going to play out. Because there was some concern when I interviewed the head of the Durham Food Prosperity Council, and she mentioned this organization. She's just like, their demographics aren't great either. They've really been very firmly entrenched in city government for a long time, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is, something to be, if you're wanting to develop this kind of structure, sort of being cognizant of how it's being formed, because right now this is what they're attempting to do.
And actually involving farmers in it. Sometimes it's people that are eating, but no farmers. So it doesn't address the issue of the real economic reality of the small farmers or the farmers that are actually producing food. That's an important aspect, I think.
Amy, you had a question?
So I was wondering, so the food justice movement is sort of necessarily a grassroots movement, and we've talked a lot about that and some state policies, but I was wondering how large of a role do you think the federal government should play in this in terms of funding? Like, for example, I'm from the Detroit area, and so I focused a lot there, and the people in Detroit have made a lot of progress with community gardening and coming up with systems, but unfortunately there's a lot of contamination from industry, and so sort of getting back to Omega's comment about you're growing this food, but are you counteracting that with the heavy metals or whatever else may be in that food? And that's a problem that requires a lot of really expensive remediation, and there are other solutions such as bringing in having like boxes and things like that use new soil, but that's also costly. And then they're also, like we were talking about, education or training farmers and things like that. And I know there's some farm bill programs that, unless they were gutted, at least some way. But in terms of sort of the interaction between the federal sort of top down and the grassroots bottom up, how much interaction is there, have you seen, and how much do you think there should be?
Can I give a really easy answer? I think it's absolutely necessary to me. And I think it's grassroots, but without the support, and even if it's just monetary funding support for infrastructure, for development, or even to set it as a priority and an indicator of what direction we all want to go, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the intermediary to me is the state. In a lot of ways, states have a good amount of authority over these kinds of decontamination programs. Whether they're applying for federal funding, fair enough, or whether they've got state-based programs. I think it's really hard. I mean, again, like this article that I read that sort of kind of led me to think about this sort of intersection between this was in 1990, and it was about, intersecting essentially food justice and environmental justice around the Farm Bill, and how like nobody was doing it and how complicated it was to get the federal government to do anything. And so I am skeptical, but I think that, to the extent that we, municipalities or states can be, can pull on existing resources, while, lobbying all the time for, maybe new resources, I really think that it's going to be, that's great, use the USDA's farm to school grants, use those types of things that are in existence and try to finagle away into using it for those kinds of purposes. You maybe try to use some of the EJ grants, make the case, that these are EJ issues. But, beyond that, I feel like kind of building the capacity and lobbying the state to really care about it. That would be my sort of next step, rather than going directly to the federal government, because I think that's the state, as we've seen, can be just as difficult. So I don't know.
And if I can, this highlights to me the changing political economies of the state. One of the things that happened this past year that's really kind of scary is the Regulatory Reform Act of 2013 that has the potential of undoing everything. And it's just ridiculous, what it has the capacity to do. So you hit on something that's a little frightening to me. So.
From the science perspective, as a federal scientist, there are things that we do. For example, look at bioavailability. So you talked about the contaminated soils, and there are ways that we're developing more rapid ways to look at the availability of that lead or that arsenic in that urban soil. I will say that when I was in Chicago, I think it was Grow Power, what they said is they love to have a paved over lot. You've already put the cap on, and part of their way of working, actually, in this very systemic way, is to deal with the food waste, to generate high quality compost, and generate soil that then they use because of this issue, and so dealing with that long-standing urban contamination, the fact that we took lead out of the gasoline 20 years ago, but it's still in Detroit soil, is still a great concern. I think it was in Milwaukee. I think it was as one of the immigrant groups from Laos or the Hmong who part of their culture was to really grow their own food, and the city and the public health had to work with them because they were growing in contaminated soils, and they needed to, generate the conditions so that they could safely grow their own food.
Thea Nance, who's one of the co-authors with Beverly Wright, actually, when I had the great opportunity of working with both her and Dr. Wright when I was in New Orleans, and we were working on partially this very issue of food contamination because a lot of the grocery stores were wiped out and people were turning to urban ag, and then they were like, oh wait, like my soil, right? And, one of the things Dr. Nance authored this article was she actually started a community-based laboratory. She's a scientist by training, and she was trying to make this case. And it never got any, traction in New Orleans, but I think it was a really smart idea is, a new role, a kind of new role for scientists. So, we use the, certainly, New Orleans folks use the ag extension at the land-grant universities and stuff like that, but sometimes, the cost of those inputs and those types of things were too much and they were overloaded. But she made the case for, community-based laboratories, because you really do need, at some point, to have people with scientific expertise, thinking about these issues in these communities, and there's a certain lack for that. But yeah, it was called People's Environmental Center. And when I moved down there, it was, there was actually she had partnered with MIT. They had built a whole lab there. And the whole purpose was, to do this sort of community-based soil testing to help the bucket brigades, all of those organizations that need the data to make their cases for environmental justice and stuff. So that was sort of another, and she got a whole bunch of sort of private grants to start that. But again, it never got any traction, but I still think it's a really great idea.
One more question?
I'm currently researching arsenic in environmental justice communities, and I'm encountering two kind of separate characterizations. So in the literature, environmental justice areas are sort of characterized as being both more vulnerable, so just by proximity, occupation, they're more vulnerable to increased exposure, and also more susceptible to the health effects due to this exposure and a whole host of non-chemical stressors. So stress, certain health behaviors, but on the other end, the federal government sort of defines it as, in the executive order and in the EPA definition, as sort of just low-income, minority, and indigenous populations. So I'm interested to hear what you think about the policymakers working from this definition.
So I heard you on the stressors, but in what communities? I think I may have missed in what communities were they observing these sort of additional sort of stressors and those types of things?
Just sort of low-income communities have more, I guess, just general stress, lack of access to health care, different health behaviors. So just, but not necessarily just low income. So,
right,
just different communities, I guess.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Michelle and I have actually been doing a good amount of talking about that, and Ben as well. Have you been reading, sorry, I'm going to ask you, have you been reading Rachel Morello Frosch et al.? Yes, yeah. Okay, that's where I thought. So it's an interesting, I think that it's, a perfectly relevant idea, and I think her argument there is that there is this sort of baseline level of health in these communities because, again, these environmental injustices are a function of underlying social inequalities. And social inequalities manifest themselves in a lot of ways that impact health, right? And so, arguably measuring health of a community by, increments of emissions, essentially, is the wrong way to go because you're missing a lot of the other health vulnerabilities. And those, and it depends on, levels of deprivation or levels of, historic discrimination. It depends on sort of how these communities are situated. And I think you're right in the sense that they, I think that they don't address these issues. It's not even acknowledged that there may be, it's sort of a presumption that all of these communities have sort of equal levels of well-being, and the way that we measure health is if, there's an excess of an emission in one facility, if they're not meeting their standards in some way. And I think that that's the wrong way to go about it. But it's hard to, it's one of those things that's hard to measure, and I think it's hard to convince people of because it doesn't comport with how we've viewed health in a lot of ways. We haven't been talking a lot about mental health, which we should. We haven't been talking about what happens with stress, because stress is incredible. It makes you incredibly vulnerable. So I think, I think you're dead on is that, and that it does vary by community. So there may be these intersectional issues. I would love to see a study of West Virginians in coal mining communities, because I think that this is a convergence that it feels like you can never make happen. And in large part, I think has to do with the sort of race history in this country. You have low-income communities that are facing environmental burdens, but you don't get the sort of integrated movement around these issues, and you get them reframed. You get them framed in ways in certain, communities than others, and I think that that's an issue, But I would love to see, if you just are having, white low-income communities like you do in West Virginia, coal mining communities, those stressors likely look very similar to the stressors that you're experiencing here in North Carolina and here in other places, but it's not talked about in tandem, I think.
Well, one of the rare events that we had to look at a kind of a direct comparison was with the peat bog fires out in eastern North Carolina, the Poquoson fires, where communities were exposed to exactly the same smoke, and ultimately it turned out, as looking at emergency room admissions or ED or emergency room discharge data, that the difference in impact was actually SES. So the poorer communities actually had worse health outcomes than the wealthier community. So same exposure, same environmental condition, but different outcome in that community. Those direct comparisons are I think are still rare. And so the question with something like arsenic is, would we expect to see a change in the dose response curve and to the effects of arsenic in a poorer community? And would that not be covered by, from a horrible regulatory perspective, would that not be covered by the uncertainty factors that we already have? Now, that doesn't address the impact in the community already, believe me. But in terms of the, figuring out the pieces of this puzzle are a real challenge.
And it's part of this discussions going on in the agency in the development of EJ Screen and the technical guidance on how to do EJ analysis. Some of the things that we run up against in particularly in EJ Screen, where you're using a GIS platform, is scales of the data. If our health data from CDC is at the county level, can you extrapolate down to the neighborhood that's most exposed? And if you don't extrapolate down, then you might have a county whose demographics is, medium income and, balanced race, but you have neighborhoods that are more impacted. So it's part of the dialogue now within the agency. Is just that we're still struggling with the, do we have the right set of data? Do we have the information to be able to explore those vulnerabilities? But it is part of, when we're building this EJ Screen, part of the questions to go through the peer review is, how do we balance, how do we incorporate those other things into the information?
But that's a really good point. So if you think about what the operational definition of environmental justice becomes for the agency, then looking at EJ Screen, which is incorporating exposure to air toxics and other risks from a number of environmental indicators, in addition perhaps to indicators of meaningful involvement or these more global terms that are in the executive order, then I think you begin to see how the agency is beginning to think about this.
But we do have examples like the definition of solid waste rule, where we looked at other social vulnerability factors like income, linguistic isolation. So we are trying to balance those other factors into the process. It's just that we're not quite as far along as I think all of us would like to be.
I've just had a hard time. One of the communities or groups that are hardest to integrate and include in the research are rural communities, because they're more likely to be on well water and exposed to arsenic. But it's like we have to prove that they're low-income minority or indigenous populations in order to include them in the whole policy making. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that panel. I think it was a really nice way of ending the day. And I guess I have a couple of closing remarks. First, I want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank all the speakers for coming to Duke and for flying in, for taking time out of your busy days to come here. I want to thank everyone else who came, especially all the government employees who I know y'all are underfunded and very busy, so we really do appreciate the time and all that you do. I want to thank Michelle especially. She helped Amy and Tyler and I kind of really think of this symposium, how we want it to look, and how to conceptualize it. and a lot of what ended up, she had a lot of influence over. I also want to thank Amy and Tyler and Chelsea. And Chelsea's actually under the weather, so she's not here today, for really pulling everything together. And also Michael and Dassie, Michael's here, for helping do a lot of the stuff that we just didn't have time to do, and they did, which was great. I also want to thank Christy Compost and Dean Melanie Dunshee, who are the journal coordinators and worked a lot behind the scenes. They're the ones that helped book the flights and book the hotels, and worked with our budget. And finally, I want to thank Miguel and the Duke Media staff, whose everything here has been recorded and being webcasted and will be put on YouTube, and they've been awesome with that. So for some closing remarks, today's symposium has really shown how expansive environmental justice is and how much it's growing. I kind of made a list of what we went over. We discussed toxic waste, mineral extraction, water quality, both above water and groundwater, agricultural waste, food deserts, fracking, access to nature, sea level rise, soil contamination, stress, and then we finish with a little lead and arsenic. So I don't know when it all began in Warren County so long ago, if you imagined environmental justice kind of expanding to cover all of that. And I think it's especially important to remember where and why it began, because we can talk about all these different things, but at the end of the day, there are still toxic wastes in these communities without enough political say-so. And as technology in our society evolves, and as we move to the renewables, it's important for us not to forget environmental justice and how these technologies can help work on these issues, as well as give us all the utilities. And it's great that we have solar, but how can we use solar energy to help with environmental justice issues? And it's great that we're regulating carbon dioxide, but we still have to properly protect the communities around their extraction of both fracking and oil consummation. The U.S. Is actually decreasing in carbon dioxide emissions, partly because of how cheap natural gas is. And all that's great on the big picture. We have to remember what fracking does potentially to groundwater and to the communities that it affects. And finally, the whole idea of not in my backyard, it's not really an acceptable glance anymore, just because if it's not in my backyard, it's going to be in someone else's backyard or from the ambassador from another country's backyard. And who knows how many of us drove our cars with oil that was extracted from the rainforest of Ecuador. I guess that was a while ago. But of some country and some people that aren't politically strong enough yet and don't live in a country that's so developed to protect their natural resources. So I think it's important to think of this as an international issue. And the symposium issue that DELF is publishing kind of does expand to the international grasp. And it looks at how the whole idea of CO2 leakage. If we don't burn it here, maybe the way we decided not to burn it, we'll be burning it in another country. And with the CO2, it doesn't matter where CO2 is burned. It goes in the same atmosphere and affects us all. And we really need to think of environmental justice as the same way. Even though environmental justice might not be here in North Carolina, if we move it to another country or we move it to another community, it really is a human rights issue. And we need to think of the net environmental justice instead of just the neighborhoods of environmental justice as well. So I hope you check the issue out when it comes out. It should be great. The pieces are great. And thank you again for coming.